I bought cruise tickets for my parents so we could finally spend some real time together since they ignored me most of my life. I had planned a surprise dinner, but they left me sitting alone at the restaurant for 2 hours, too busy shopping for a birthday gift for my golden boy brother, whose birthday wasn't for another 2 weeks. I shared photos from the cruise with someone else on Facebook, and now I'm the selfish, ungrateful one? There's a special kind of pain that comes from being the forgotten child, especially when you're desperate for your parents' love. I learned that lesson the hard way again and again until one night it all came crashing down. I want to make something abundantly clear right from the start. I have never been the favorite child in my family. And no, this isn't some exaggeration or a false belief I've cooked up in my mind. It's been a very real, very prominent aspect of my entire life. My parents never even tried to hide the fact that my younger brother's life held more value to them. For context, my mom got pregnant with my brother Jackson just a year after I was born. It wasn't planned at all, but they were still overjoyed at the idea of expanding their family. What started as pure excitement quickly turned into sheer anxiety when doctors ran some tests and discovered the possibility of serious health issues with the baby. These weren't minor concerns. They were significant enough that my parents faced the heartbreaking decision of whether or not to terminate the pregnancy. It was an incredibly difficult time for them, but they ultimately chose to continue, fully aware of the challenges that might lie ahead. When Jackson was finally born, their fears became reality. He had some significant heart defects that needed immediate attention. My parents were absolutely devastated. Jackson needed multiple surgeries just to survive, and he spent a huge amount of time in the hospital. His health became the absolute center of my family's universe, and that shift profoundly impacted everything, including how I was treated. My parents were consumed by fear, love, and guilt over Jackson's condition. And while I completely understand they were dealing with something incredibly difficult, it also meant that I was, in many ways, completely sidelined. During the time my brother was in the hospital, I ended up staying with my grandparents because my parents were simply too preoccupied with Jackson's medical needs. They barely visited me during that period. I tried not to hold it against them. I understood, even at a young age, that Jackson's health took precedence, and my parents were doing the best they could. Plus, I genuinely loved my time with my grandparents. They were so warm and attentive. Every morning, my grandmother would cook me breakfast, and then we'd spend hours doing simple things around the house, whether it was baking cookies or tending to her garden. My grandfather would take me to the park or read me stories. Both of them filled the huge gaps left by my parents' absence, practically becoming a second set of parents for me. Eventually, Jackson's health improved, and my parents were able to bring him home from the hospital. You'd think that would be the moment they'd come to collect me, right? They'd want to bring me back, to reunite the family. But no, that wasn't the case. My mom, still overwhelmed by the stress of Jackson's recovery and the sheer exhaustion of managing a sick child, decided she wasn't ready to take on the responsibility of 2 kids. She told my grandparents they'd need to keep caring for me for a little longer. My dad, busy with work and trying to juggle the financial burden of Jackson's medical bills, didn't offer much help either. My grandparents, who truly loved having me around, didn't protest much. They were more than happy to keep me, and while I did feel a pang of sadness knowing I wasn't going back home, I wasn't completely devastated. I was still in a place where I felt loved, and that comforted me. I think the real trouble began when years went by, and my parents still showed no signs of wanting to bring me back home. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement had stretched out indefinitely. I'd only get to see them every other weekend, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Sometimes my dad was too busy with work, and other times they simply didn't make the effort to come see me. It became the norm that my grandparents were my primary caregivers, and my parents became something like visitors in my life rather than actual parents. When I started going to school, it was my grandparents who handled everything. They dropped me off in the morning and picked me up in the afternoon. They were there from the moment I woke up until they tucked me into bed. They made sure I had my school supplies, helped with my homework, and ensured I was cared for. My parents, on the other hand, never checked in. It didn't matter to them whether I went to school every day, or even how I was doing academically. If I got sick, it was my grandparents who looked after me. It was as if my parents had completely handed over their responsibilities to them. When they did visit, their conversations revolved solely around Jackson. They would go on and on to my grandparents about how wonderful Jackson was, how brave he was for recovering from his surgeries, and how much progress he was making. I don't think they ever once asked my grandparents about me, how I was doing, what was going on in my life, or how I was feeling. I started to feel completely invisible. I can't even recall a single moment where my parents and I spent time together, just the 3 of us. There was no one-on-one time, no effort to rebuild any bond with me. Everything was about Jackson. Then came a moment I'll never forget. Jackson's birthday party. My parents threw a huge celebration for him since he was doing so well. They invited friends, family, neighbors, everyone. My grandparents brought me along. Throughout the party, I couldn't shake the deep feeling of jealousy gnawing at me. Watching Jackson looking so happy with my parents doting on him endlessly. The whole event was centered around him, and while I knew it was his special day, I couldn't help but feel completely left out. Here I was, a child too, but all the attention and love I longed for was being lavished on my brother. I don't know exactly when it happened, but the overwhelming emotions of seeing my parents around my younger brother just bubbled up, and before I knew it, I burst loudly into tears in front of everyone. I remember feeling so ashamed in that moment, knowing everyone could see me unraveling. My grandparents, bless them, quickly took me to another room and tried their best to comfort me, but the sadness and jealousy were just too much. Some of the other guests noticed too and tried to offer kind words, but nothing really made me feel better. It wasn't about the presents or the party. It was about the attention and love I was so starved for, and watching my parents shower all of that on Jackson was just too much for me to bear. Later, after the birthday party, my parents and grandparents had a huge fight. Apparently, my parents were deeply embarrassed by my emotional outburst at the party. They felt it was too childish of me to cry in front of everyone, and in their eyes, my behavior had caused unnecessary attention to fall on them. It wasn't just about me being upset. It had invited people to question my living situation. People had started to ask why I was never at home with my parents, why I was being raised by my grandparents, and whether my parents were neglecting me. My parents were furious that this scrutiny had been directed at them, and they saw my crying as the trigger that set everything off. I could hear them blaming me for putting them in a position where they had to explain themselves. After that argument, a decision was made. I would move back home to live with my parents. This was something I had wanted for years, and yet when it finally happened, I didn't feel any of the excitement I thought I would. Instead, I was filled with apprehension. The first few days back home were painfully awkward. The house felt foreign to me, and I constantly felt out of place, like I was intruding into a space that wasn't mine. My parents had their own routines, built around Jackson's needs and schedule. They barely acknowledged me, and if they did, it was only in passing. I had hoped that moving back home would finally mean they would take notice of me, that they would care about me the way they did Jackson. But it was quickly clear that nothing had changed. Jackson was still the center of their world, and I remained on the outskirts, ignored and forgotten. The only thing I was grateful for was that I had my own room. I spent most of my time there when I wasn't at school. It wasn't because I was happy to be alone, but because being around my parents made me feel more invisible than when I was away from them. At least in my room, I didn't have to witness the affection they showered on Jackson while I sat unnoticed. I would stay there for hours doing my homework or just lying on my bed, trying to make sense of it all. Throughout my entire school life, my parents never showed the slightest interest in my education or achievements. Not once did they ask about my homework, nor did they ever attend any of my award ceremonies. Even when I participated in school plays or extracurricular activities, they simply couldn't be bothered to show up or even acknowledge that I was involved in anything. It was as if nothing I did mattered to them. Despite their complete disregard for my accomplishments, I made sure to excel in school. The few times my grandparents tried to step in and remind my parents of my successes, it was met with either silence or outright dismissal. They would encourage my parents to show some appreciation or even just a bit of pride in me, but my parents would either ignore the comments or scoff, as if it was of no consequence. It hurt so much to see how little they cared. What made it even worse was the stark contrast in how they treated Jackson. Jackson never performed well academically. He struggled in school and often got into trouble. He'd bring home poor grades, and sometimes his teachers even called home about his behavior. But none of that seemed to faze my parents. They never held him accountable for his lack of effort, and they certainly didn't discipline him. If he ever did remotely average on a test or managed to achieve anything small, my parents would celebrate as if it were a monumental achievement. They would order pizza or take us all out to his favorite restaurant, making it a big family event. When I finally graduated high school and got accepted into college, I was fortunate enough to earn a partial scholarship. Even though it covered some of the costs, I was still nervous about how I would manage the remaining expenses. At the time, I asked my parents if they had set up any kind of college fund for me. Part of me already knew what the answer would be, but I had to ask. As expected, they immediately informed me that all the money they were saving was for Jackson only. They said he was the youngest and that he would need to be taken care of in the future. My father bluntly told me that as the oldest, I should learn to take care of myself. He did offer to help me apply for an education loan, which I would then have to pay off later when I got a job. It was incredibly painful to hear that my own parents continued to not prioritize me. While other parents are generally excited and proud to help their children start their journey into adulthood, mine were basically telling me I was on my own. Thankfully, my grandparents had seen this coming long before I did, and they had been quietly planning for my future. They had set up a trust fund for me in secret years ago. When they finally revealed this to me and told me I never had to worry about college, I was in complete shock. I couldn't believe that someone had actually cared enough to do something like this for me. I cried tears of joy because for the first time I felt truly supported. It felt surreal. No one had ever gone out of their way to look out for me in this way, and here were my grandparents, who not only saw my potential but had taken steps to ensure I could go to college without having to worry about the financial burden. But when my parents found out about the trust fund my grandparents had set up for me, they didn't share in my joy or relief. Instead of being happy for me, they immediately turned the conversation towards Jackson. Their first response was to ask my grandparents if they had also set up a trust fund for him. My grandfather calmly pointed out that they had decided to take care of me specifically because my parents had always prioritized Jackson, and they had seen for years how I had been overlooked. They wanted to make sure I had the chance to succeed without being held back. Of course, this did not sit well with my parents. They saw it as unfair, and they immediately started a heated argument with my grandparents about how both grandchildren should be treated equally. They accused my grandparents of playing favorites and insisted that Jackson deserved their money too, simply because he was the youngest in the family. They couldn't accept that my grandparents had chosen to help me, because they recognized how neglected I had been all these years. It was like my parents were blind to the fact that they had already spent Jackson's entire life treating him like the center of the universe. Despite the pressure and accusations, my grandparents stood their ground. They didn't back down or let my parents manipulate the situation. They explained that this wasn't about favoritism. It was about ensuring that I had the same opportunities as Jackson was already being given by my parents. My grandparents had made their decision out of love and fairness, because they knew that I hadn't been given the same attention and support that Jackson had always received. Seeing that they couldn't sway my grandparents, my parents then turned their efforts towards me. They tried to guilt me into sharing some of the trust fund with them, insisting that I should invest in Jackson's future when it came time for him to go to college. They framed it as if I was being selfish by keeping the money for myself, even though it wasn't my money to give away. It was my grandparents' gift to me. I refused. I told them that it wasn't my responsibility to provide for Jackson's education, especially when he was so young. They had already made it clear that their financial priorities were always with him. My parents were furious with my decision, but there was nothing they could do. For once, they didn't have the upper hand. I wasn't going to give away what had been given to me out of love and care just because they thought Jackson deserved everything. It was a painful moment, realizing that even in this my parents couldn't be happy for me. But it was also empowering because I finally understood that I had to stand up for myself, even if it meant going against my parents. As a result, after I left for college, my relationship with my parents became virtually non-existent. They stopped pretty much all communication with me, as they continued to believe what I did was selfish towards my brother. Jackson and I had also never been close. He was comfortable being the favorite child, and with me out of the house, he didn't have to compete for our parents' attention. He never once called me to check in or visited me during my time in college, which wasn't surprising, but it still hurt. The only people who truly cared and remained in my life were my grandparents. They were my emotional support, the ones who always checked in on me, encouraging me, and making sure I didn't feel entirely abandoned. But then, during my third year of college, my world was turned upside down. My grandfather passed away unexpectedly after suffering a heart attack in his sleep. His death shattered me. It was without a doubt the darkest time of my life. I stayed with my grandmother for several days as we both grieved together. It was an unimaginable loss for the two of us. My grandfather had been a father figure to me in every way that mattered, and losing him left a gaping hole in my heart. During this painful time, something unexpected happened. I reconnected with my parents and Jackson. All of us were shaken by my grandfather's death, and for the first time in years, we found ourselves bonding over shared grief. Even though I had so many unresolved feelings towards my parents, there was something about the situation that brought us a little closer. It felt like, for a brief moment, the walls between us had come down. My grandfather had even left behind a letter for my mom, and in it, he urged her to stop ignoring my existence and to take care of both her children, not just Jackson. He reminded her of the importance of family, and how she couldn't afford to keep treating one child better than the other, the way she had all these years. I guess something shifted after that. My parents, perhaps for the first time, seemed to feel genuinely guilty about how they had treated me. Slowly, they began to make an effort to reconnect. They started calling me more frequently, asking about my studies, and showing some interest in my life. It wasn't perfect. The pain of the past couldn't be undone so easily, but it was something. I was still angry with them for all the years they had ignored me, for all the times I needed them and they weren't there. But at the same time I could see they were trying, and that gave me a small sense of hope. I wanted to believe that they could change, that maybe, just maybe, they were starting to realize their mistakes. When I finally graduated from college, my parents actually showed up for the ceremony. They took pictures with me, proud smiles on their faces. It felt surreal to have them there, considering all the years they hadn't even acknowledged my achievements. After the ceremony, we all, my parents, Jackson, my grandmother, and I, went out for lunch to celebrate. It was one of the rare moments when I felt like we were a family, even if only for a little while. For once, I wasn't invisible to them, and that small act of acknowledgement meant more to me than I could express. This year, after landing my first proper, high-paying job and receiving my big paycheck, I wanted to do something special to celebrate. I thought, why not share this moment with my family? I hadn't had much quality time with my parents growing up, so I decided I would surprise them with something meaningful. A cruise trip, just the three of us. No distractions, no obligations, just quality time together to make up for what we had missed over the years. I knew deep down that I still craved their attention, even after all these years of feeling overlooked. As for Jackson, I planned to buy him something nice later so he wouldn't feel left out. I wanted this to be a complete surprise for my parents, so instead of just calling them, I booked a reservation at a fancy, expensive restaurant where we could have a nice dinner and celebrate. When I called my parents to invite them, they seemed excited, thrilled even about visiting the restaurant. They promised they would be there on time. But when I arrived at the restaurant right on time, my parents were nowhere to be seen. At first, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were caught in traffic or running just a little late. But after 15, 20, then 30 minutes had passed, I started to get nervous. I called them multiple times, and it wasn't until the fifth call that they finally answered. My dad casually mentioned that they were finishing up some last-minute errands, as if it was no big deal, and that they would be reaching the restaurant soon. Annoyed but still hopeful, I stayed at the table, waiting for them to arrive. The server kept coming by, asking if the rest of my party had arrived, and I felt more embarrassed with each passing minute. I didn't want to look like someone who had been stood up at a nice restaurant, so eventually, I ordered food for myself as I was hungry. I finished my meal still sitting alone, staring at the empty seats across from me. My calls to my parents went unanswered after that. An hour passed and then nearly 2 hours. Finally, after my 15th try, my dad picked up the phone. He started apologizing, but I was beyond frustrated at this point. I started yelling at him about what they had been doing all this time, and why they couldn't have just told me if they weren't going to make it. "Oh, just stop complaining," he said dismissively. "I'm sorry we're late, but your mother and I got held up at the shop. We found the perfect birthday gift for your brother. But when we got to the counter, we realized your mother had left her card at home. So we had to drive back to get it. Thankfully, the shop held our gift, and we were able to purchase it just now. Jackson is going to be so happy with what we picked out for him. By the way, have you bought anything for your brother yet? You do remember his birthday's in 2 weeks, right?" At that moment, I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. Here I was trying to share a special moment with my parents, to celebrate my achievements and bring us closer. But once again, Jackson was all that mattered to them. They had spent the entire evening shopping for his birthday gift, while not even bothering that I had been sitting alone at the restaurant, waiting for them. Not only had they missed the dinner, but they had the nerve to ask if I had remembered to buy something for Jackson. I was fuming, but I tried to keep my composure as I told my dad that they could have shopped for Jackson any other day. They should have respected my time, especially knowing this was something I had gone out of my way to plan for them. My dad's response just made it worse. He brushed off my concerns and said they were on their way now and that we could talk about this after they reached. However, I didn't want to stay there any longer, as I felt so pissed at my parents. I paid my check, got up from the table and left. On my way back home, my phone started buzzing. My parents were calling me, leaving voicemail after voicemail saying they had finally arrived at the restaurant and couldn't find me anywhere. I ignored their calls, feeling too angry and hurt to even think about talking to them. Later that night, my mom sent me a series of messages. Instead of apologizing or acknowledging that they had messed up, she attacked me. She called me rude for not being there when they finally arrived, as if I was the one who had wasted their time. She had the audacity to say that this was why they didn't care about my irrelevant plans in the first place, since I was always so hot-headed, and how they were right to have gone shopping for Jackson because his gift was more important to buy anyway. According to her, their priorities were perfectly justified, and I was the one in the wrong for getting pissed at them. Reading her messages, I felt a wave of hurt and anger again. I had poured my heart into planning something special, and all I got in return was the same disregard I had felt my entire life. I just couldn't keep dealing with their hurtful words and their constant disregard for my feelings. After everything I had done to make this moment special, I was left feeling more alone than ever, realizing that no matter what I did, Jackson would always come first, and I would always be an afterthought. I blocked her without bothering to send her a reply. The reason I bought those cruise tickets in the first place was because my parents had been showing some significant changes in their behavior after my grandpa's death. I thought they finally saw me as a human being, as their child. But I guess I was wrong again. I'm glad my eyes are open now, and from that day onwards, I was done trying and crying for their attention. I blocked both of them on my phone. It seems my parents filled Jackson in on the whole incident, and he called me that week to discuss everything. My brother actually believes that what our parents did wasn't wrong, and I should have respected them enough to wait for their arrival instead of leaving at the last minute. He mentioned how our parents were very disappointed in me, and had reached out to him to complain about my actions. He even asked me to attend his upcoming birthday party so I could apologize to our parents. I declined his invitation and asked him to leave me alone for the time being. He did try to argue with me further, but I firmly reminded him that my relationship with our parents had nothing to do with him, and he would never understand what I was going through. So it's been a month since that last update, and for everyone asking, I did consider canceling my cruise tickets. But then I realized I had spent a significant amount of my paycheck buying them, so I should make better use of it. Hence, I decided to take my best friend and my grandma with me on the trip instead of my parents. Suffice it to say, the three of us had a wonderful time, and I pretty much forgot about all the drama with my parents. This trip was a well-deserved break for all of us. However, after the trip, when I posted a few pictures from our cruise, I started receiving messages from my dad on Facebook, calling me selfish and ungrateful for taking grandma on the trip and not inviting them either. I had forgotten to block my parents from Facebook since I thought they hardly ever used it. The audacity of my dad to even expect me to take him after everything he and mom had put me through. He also told me how sad mom was after I had blocked her, and how he wishes for me to just go to therapy and get over my childish behavior so I can stop punishing them for the rest of my life. It's been 4 months since that last update, and I'm doing just fine. I've blocked both my parents and Jackson. I'll admit, since cutting them off, my life feels much more peaceful. I've come to accept the fact that sometimes, family isn't what you're born into, but what you choose. And that, I've realized, is a powerful lesson.